Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the eighth event of the Amsterdam Center for European Studies Decolonizing Europe series. My name is Beste İşleyen, and together with my colleague Tasnim Anwar, we have been doing this series since last June. Today, I am really happy and honored to host a leading scholar in decolonial studies and subaltern studies, Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty. Welcome, Professor Chakrabarty. Thanks for accepting our invitation. So the title of our event today is Provincializing Europe, Revisiting Debates on Global Warming and the Anthropocene. I want to introduce our speaker. So Professor Chakrabarty is Lawrence A. Kimpton Distinguished Service Professor of History, South Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. So he's a leading scholar with a wide range of field specialties, including modern South Asian history, subaltern indigenous and minority studies, history of public life and environmental history, and the implications of climate change for human history. So Professor Chakrabarty is founding member of the editorial collective of Subaltern Studies and a founding editor of Postcolonial Studies. And he has served on editorial boards of leading outlets in the field. So Professor Chakrabarty has published several books and numerous articles, including his groundbreaking monograph, Provincializing Europe, Postcolonial Thought and Historical Difference, which came out in 2000 from Princeton. Of course, this brief introduction cannot do justice to Professor Chakrabarty's immense contributions to postcolonial and decolonial thought. So today we will focus on his current research on the implications of the science of climate change for historical and political thought. So I want to kick off the conversation on your tenor lectures in human values entitled The Human Condition in the Anthropocene. So in your lectures, you're interested in the question of time, and that was really interesting for me to read as well. So my first question relates to this interest of yours. What motivated you to rethink our senses of time, particularly in relation to the intersecting topics of globalization and global warming? The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Beste, for inviting me to your forum, and very honored to be here. Is my volume clear? Am I audible? Is this, the volume is right? Okay. So, you know, I did not think about climate change until about 2003. Though scientists were talking about climate change from the 1950s, if not from before. And climate change became a global topic when the United Nations set up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, right? IPCC, around 1988 or 89. Remember that there was a crisis of a hole in the ozone layer in the mid-1980s, which was fixed eventually by a technical solution, but which led to the Montreal Protocol. And the Montreal Protocol led to the setting up of the IPCC in 1988 or 89. And the American government was told about global warming by James Hansen, the scientist. And from 1991, the same time when people were writing books about globalization, people were also writing books explaining climate change. But people who were reading about globalization were not reading those books. So if you look at historians, even though there were popular books on climate change, they were not reading them. So a very well-known Harvard historian, Charles Meyer, was asked by the American Historical Review at the end of the last century, 2000, to sum up the century as a historian. And he wrote a very interesting erudite article called Consigning the 20th Century to History, which was published in the American Historical Review that year. If you read that article, you will find that he obviously talks about the two great wars, he talks about decolonization, he talks about the Vietnam War, civil liberties, indigenous people's movements, all of those things, but not a word about climate change. 15 years later, when the historian Christopher Bailey's book, the second volume to his Making of the Modern World, is published in 2015, there is actually a chapter on the Anthropocene. So you ask what happened in the 15 years that historians began to catch up with the news of the Anthropocene, right? And what happened was, in many ways, that the fact of global warming or the phenomenon of global warming became kind of big news. The media took it up. Only after the IPCC published its fourth assessment report, which came out in 2007. And it just suddenly, it began to be everybody's concern. I mean, it was on everybody's mouth. And so it made me realize, looking back, that even historians are dependent on what the media picks up. If the media doesn't pick it up, it's not part of our history. So because the media had not picked up global warming big time until 2000, until the fourth assessment came out, historians were mainly ignoring it, right? But now we know that it is something that's been happening for at least 2 centuries, maybe speeded up after the war. My own awareness came from my involvement with Australia. So Australia had a huge, big fire in the city where I did my PhD, Canberra, the capital. And it destroyed all the nature spots I used to love around the city. And it burned down 300 houses, people died, thousands of animals died. And all those nature spots were destroyed. And Australia was going through a big drought. And I asked people, what's happening? Why these fires happen? Horrible fires. Because, in a place like Australia, there are normal bushfires, which have to do with the regeneration of gum trees. So fires are not unusual, but this was a huge fire. And then the more knowledgeable friends kept telling me, oh, this is not an ordinary drought. This is climate change. And I said, what is climate change? So I began to read up on climate change. And when I read about climate change, my view of the world was completely turned around by what the scientists were saying. Because, I had grown up as a post-colonial historian interested in imperialism, colonialism, rights of indigenous people, rights of minorities, race question, caste question. Those were my concerns. And I had my coming of age as a young historian was during when works of E.P. Thompson, Eric Hobsbawm, the social historians, were becoming popular. Actually, Eric Hobsbawm was my PhD examiner. And we were getting very used to the idea that human beings are agents, that women have agency, peasants have agency. The way to write democratic history is to give people their agency. While the climate scientists I was reading was saying, look, but human beings with their technology and their numbers and the expansion of economic activities have become a geological agent or a geophysical force. And they were using the word agent, not in our sense, right? They were comparing us to a huge earthquake, to a meteorite strike. So they were saying that the human social system with its technology, economy, our language, extractive capitalism, was becoming such a system that it was actually changing the climate of the planet as a whole, which may, they were saying, lead to a third great extinction of life. And if that happens, then it will be first time in the history of this planet that a biological species like humans and its technology and system it's set up will bring about a great destruction of life, that extinction of life. Because the other 5 extinctions have all been caused by meteorite strike or a volcanic eruption, not by a living being, not by biological species. So I thus thought, wow. And why is it happening? So its immediate cause was the use of fossil fuel. But use of fossil fuel, that is the availability of cheap, plentiful energy, is also what gave us a lot of freedoms. It actually improved medicine. It improved irrigation. It produced more food. it allowed human beings to sustain more people. So when you look at human population, so if humans, Homo sapiens, evolved about 300,000 years ago, it took almost 300,000 years for the number to reach 1 billion, which is around 1900. At the end of that century, that is by 2000, we were 6 billion. So in 100 years, we multiplied almost 5 times. And then now we're getting close to 8. And if you look at use of farmland, if you look at land use, economy, productivity, everything was increasing, right? So historians and climate science now talk about this thing they call great acceleration. So suddenly everything exponentially increasing after 1950, modernization, everything. So suddenly they were connecting human history to this huge, big geological scale history of the planet. So that's what got me interested. And I wrote up my first thoughts in that, after I began to read from 2003, I wrote up my first thoughts around 2008 in my own language, my first language, Bengali, for a Bengali magazine in Calcutta. And nobody was interested. Because they said, these are not we want to think about, these are Western concerns. We are really more about class, race, imperialism. You're losing your way. And then I came back to America, having published this in Bengali. And one of my colleagues, I was then on the board of Critical Inquiry, the journal, which published my first essay. And they came to me and they said, we are running short of good articles. Do you have anything that you can give us? So I said, oh, well, I have this thing in Bengali, which I may translate and expand. And then I published the Climate of History 4 thesis in 2009. And I got a lot of appreciation, but it also led to a lot of criticism. People were saying that, look, this idea of Anthropocene doesn't look at the role of capitalism. It should be called all kinds of debates that have happened, right? But that's how I suddenly became aware that we were living through a moment when human history, which happens on a small scale, usually, these institutions, that, the time horizons of your actions is your life. The time horizons of a oil company is at the most 300 years because they do calculations on how long oil will last. But a colleague of mine came out with a book called Human Beings Have Already Changed the Climate of the Planet for the Next 100,000 Years. Another colleague, not a colleague, but some other scholar published a book saying that the next ice age has been pushed back by anything between 5,000 to 50,000 years. So suddenly I had this feeling that we are caught up in multiple scales of events. And you might also say that we have, with some of these, we have the experience of being outscaled, right? The scale is so immense that you may not be able to fix things on such a large scale, whereas certain things you may be able to fix. So that's why this idea of multiple scales of time, to situate human history in multiple scales of time, to situate human history at the intersection of globalization and global warming, started as an effort in my head. And I eventually realized that the word globe in the expression globalization, that word globe does not have the same meaning as the word globe in the expression global warming. And that was something that I played around with, and eventually it led to my sense that we have to make a distinction between the globe and the planet. So my forthcoming book, which should be out by March next year, called The Climate of History in a Planetary Age, argues that we live at the intersection of the global and the planetary. So that the idea that we are just in a global age is not sufficient any longer to help us to understand the nature of the historical time we are living through.
Yeah, well, thank you. And thanks also for sharing your experience about your publication and people saying that these are Western concerns. That connects well with the second question that I want to ask with you, to you. One of the recurring themes in your work is also the issue of responsibility. And you also raise an important question about the meaning of common but differentiated responsibilities in climate change debates. And your observation is that whereas the expression of differentiated responsibilities is clear, the word common is less obvious. Can I ask you to elaborate on this a bit? And also you rely on the German theorist Karl Jasper's conception of epochal consciousness.
Particularly in the Tanner lectures and actually in the conclusion to my book that is in press. Yeah, so let's come to epochal consciousness. Later, let's talk about the common but differentiated responsibility, right? So you see what happens. So let me speak as a historian, so that you see the sequence of events. So the ozone hole crisis, the crisis that there was a hole in the ozone layer, becomes news in the mid-1980s. I was there in Australia. I was then in Australia teaching in Australia. And this became a huge concern because the hole was apparently on top of Australia. And having that hole meant that more UV radiation was coming through. And because Australians love to go to the beach and sunbathe, so there was an advertising campaign saying, the jingle went like slip, slop, slap, and was reminding people to put on all kinds of sun protection creams to protect themselves from the UV radiation, which can give you cancer. So then what happened, we were very lucky, humans were very lucky that we found out that the hole in the ozone layer was being caused by the chemical that we were using as the propellant in cans, right, in spray cans. And we were lucky, countries got together and they replaced the chemical. So the hole eventually became a little smaller. Right? Following that, so if you conceptually think about it, after the war, the United Nations is set up to deal with a world that is experiencing Cold War, where America has become the new dominant power for the West. But the United Nations is set up with the idea that all the nations will come together and deal with all global problems. But the assumption in understanding global problem was that humans being had indefinite amount of time in their hands to solve these problems. So if you ask the United Nations, when do you think the Israeli-Palestinian problem will be solved? Or when do you think the Kashmir problem will be solved? The answer would be, or any of these big problems in human history, and the answer will be, we don't know, it might take 500 years, it might take 200 years, we'll just have to work towards it, right? So the UN thought, we thought that the ozone hole layer is another global problem. So let's set up a committee to do it. Same way, when scientists were confirmed that the world was hotting up, global warming is happening, we set up the IPCC. And the IPCC, the setting up of the IPCC was followed up soon by a report from the World Resources Institute saying that this is a human problem, everybody's problem. And soon after that, we had the Rio conference on environment. And two Indian environmental activists, Sunita Narayan and Anil Agarwal is dead now, they were at this conference saying, we are very, very skeptical of the understanding that this is whole humans problem. This is another Western ploy because the West and the developed countries are more responsible for emission of greenhouse gases. The poor people don't emit greenhouse gases. So they published a book called Global Warming in an Unequal World, a case of environmental colonialism. And it was at their insistence that people began to calculate per capita emissions. And when you do per capita emissions, it's very clear that the Americans per capita emit 20 times greenhouse gases than a poor peasant in Vietnam, right? So they said you can't equate all of these people into one human thing. And therefore, people had to agree that the responsibility was differentiated. Some people had more historical responsibility for this. Then what happened was Americans wouldn't agree to the description. So simply to make Americans happy, somebody put in common. Because Americans said they would sign on, but they eventually didn't sign on. But they said they would sign on if it said common but differentiated. And so that's how differentiated responsibility, the expression contains within it the history of empires, the history of capitalism, the history of uneven development, the history of exploitation, the fact that when you have capitalism, the other becomes racialized. I mean, you don't just dominate somebody, you dominate somebody because they're different. All of those things that we dealt with in postcolonial history or in decolonial writing. But what happened in the meanwhile also is that the warming soon, for also to be globalization, all kinds of interesting global reasons, China became the highest emitter. So China was initially, if you look at Chinese positions, initially they took the same position that that the developed countries were responsible. But very soon, China became a developed country because it became the factory for the entire world, right? And in some ways, what happened was countries like Europe passed on their emissions to China. So China would make the shirt that you wear, and China would be responsible for the emissions to make the shirt, right? And if you look at it, 12 or 14 nations that do 90% of the emissions, including India and China. So India is third or fourth, depending on how you calculate it. And then there was this so-called fourth world, the island nations in the Pacific and places which were blaming also India and China for their role in the production of greenhouse gases. So that's why the argument that the responsibility is completely differentiated and there should be compensation or technology coming from the first world to China and India, that argument became a little blunt. By the time of the Paris climate deal 2015, that argument was not the argument driving the Paris climate deal. And the other thing that happens is if you look at the number of people who consume, who get the benefits of capitalism, people who buy refrigerators, cars. So for that number to reach 1 billion was about 1985, when the number of people who constitute the consuming classes were 1 billion. And in that 1 billion, Europeans and North Americans were about 70, 80% of that number. The next billion, so by the time we come to 2 billion people becoming consuming classes, is around 2006, in 21 years. And the Europeans and Americans' share of that number was falling, so that today they constitute about 35% of the consuming classes. The bulk of them are in Asia, Africa, and emergent new countries, right? So in some ways, you can see that the India and China are actually also participating in a big way in the classes that are consuming what the planet produces. So that older argument about differentiated responsibility, about capital, got a little murky because of the rising aspirations. So in some ways, I think we need to take responsibility for our desire to modernize. And the number of years it's taking to add 1 billion to, in fact, so if you think at 21, then the second billion was added in 9 years. Then it's sort of 7 and 6, it's actually going down. So now we have got 3 billion people consuming. And it's predicted that the number will go up to 5 billion people. Right? And at the same time, I told you how human numbers increased. Indian population has increased more than 5 times in my lifetime. Cities have increased, becoming unlivable for many people. But people are coming to the cities. The world is getting urbanized. So all of these problems show that we are, at least the elites of these nations, are sometimes as implicated in producing the climate crisis of the world as historically the Western nations were, right? So Peter Singer, the philosopher, makes a distinction between countries, nations that are retrospectively guilty and responsible, and nations that are prospectively guilty and responsible. So today, if you simply talk about the capitalism as though it's only the developed countries, if you talk about empires as if only we're talking about the past, 500 years, you don't take enough responsibility for what the Asian middle classes are also wanting and doing, for our own desires to modernize. India wants to be like America. China wants to be like America, dominant world power, consuming, prosperous, whatever. We don't take responsibility for that. So if you take responsibility for that, then the simple blame game of the past becomes more complicated. So that's why there's a talk about historical responsibility and there's a talk about responsibility going forward. But the responsibility question is made even more complicated by the fact that because of this growth of economy and the growth of human numbers and technology, even poor people live longer. So if you look at human lifespan, in a place like India, it's actually improved for even poor people because of public health, modern medicine, modern communication, the ability to transfer medicine from one place to another, So in some ways, we have all differentially benefited from the expansion of the global economy. But the environmental crisis is like, we are now getting the bill for having lived so well. So the costs are becoming more visible. At what price do we live so well?
Yeah, thank you for this contribution, Professor Chakrabarty. I want to talk a little bit more on the issue of responsibility because you come to this theme a lot in your work, and especially when you call for making a distinction between the terms human and anthropos. And you argue that the attribution of these terms to the issue of responsibility is not straightforward, but highly contested by states such as China and India. And then you also make an argument related to that, and which is the term humanity differentiates itself when we bring in the moral. Can you say a few words on this?
So, okay. Maybe let me stop you and answer that and also come back to the question of epochal consciousness, which I didn't come back to. So first of all, see, my thoughts on climate change, global warming have been evolving, partly because I've been reading the science and teaching myself. So reading earth system science and reading geology and biology. For instance, when I first wrote about climate change, I did not realize how connected geology and biology are on this planet. You can't separate geology and biology. Whereas when I wrote my fourth thesis, I made a distinction between biological agency and geological agency. And now I wouldn't make that distinction so strongly. So the reason why the responsibility question becomes complicated again is that, so my argument is that this expansion of global capitalism, and the expansion of global capitalism also is an expansion of a part of capitalism that we often call extractive capitalism, where we build more mines, we mine the planet, we take timber out of forests, where you actually destroy natural resources, to have this. I mean, to give you an example, India is going through a construction boom. Now the economy has dipped a little. China has been through a huge boom. And I know, for instance, when the Beijing Olympics happened and China became a huge magnet for iron ores globally. the number of illegal iron mines in India, illegal, went into several tens of thousands. People were just picking up iron and exporting it to China. The number of hills that have been raised to the ground to mine marble for the kitchens of the consuming classes so that they can have a granite kitchen bench or a white marble kitchen bench. The number of hills that have been illegally raised, destroyed in India is amazing. If you look at topographical maps, they exist. They don't exist in reality. So the extractive capitalism also expanded. And what happens is that you can then see that capitalism produces inequality. So Thomas Piketty's work showing that inequality has actually increased in the world over the last several decades, right? But it also produces a certain complex that dominates the order of life. Humans, our technology, and the life forms that depend on us. So squirrels, dogs, cows, the most populous bird on the planet, biggest in number. If you don't know, you'll be amazed, is broiler chicken. There are 21 billion broiler chicken on the planet. The next most populous bird, I forget the name, and it's naturally populous, is 1.5 billion. So there are so many cows because we eat them and we need them for the milk industry. There are so many chickens. So humans, their technology, plus the animals and birds we keep, we eat, have become the dominant order of life on this planet. So on the one hand, capitalism produces us as differentiated between humans, between rich and poor. And that becomes the ground for decolonial studies, postcolonial studies, all of those things. The same capitalism produces us as part of this dominant order of life. Somewhat what in older terms you might call a dominant species, but it's not just the human species, it's human species, it's human technology, and all the other species that we actually want to have. So the result is, in the last 50, 60 years, 60% decline has been seen in other vertebrates. So, if you look at vertebrate mass in the world, now 95% of the vertebrate mass in the planet is made up of humans and of the animals we eat and keep. Only 5% is genuinely wild animals. And even wild animals losing their habitat. So I'm making the point that we are both a differentiated humanity, but a dominant species. So humanity and species are two different terms and refer to different ways of looking at us. So, I don't any longer use the anthropos homo distinction in my book. The 10-hour lectures, I gave them at a particular point of the evolution of my thought, and I'm moving towards the same idea and use that. I found it. So I'm trying to make a distinction between a certain formation of humans, which is about my way of reaching towards what I was calling the common. What is the common? And a certain formation of human which we recognize, being historians, being political scientists, that is the differentiated thing. So when I say that humans are morally always divided, I had in mind Carl Schmitt's on the concept of the political, where he clearly says that humanity is a pluriverse. You will never find a world in which all humans will have become Marxists. You will never find a world in which all humans will become decolonial. You will never find a world in which all humans will agree to provincializing Europe. Because that's what we are. We are by nature a pluriverse. We disagree. And whatever path we find going forward has to be found through our disagreements. So when I talked about epochal consciousness, when I was talking about Jasper's and epochal consciousness, I was trying to find a form of thinking in which we could try to produce a ground of agreement before we disagreed. So for instance, we may be able to agree, even though there are climate deniers, but we may be able to agree that global warming is happening. Then we might disagree on responsibility. We might disagree on what to do about it. Those disagreements will remain. But so epochal consciousness is actually about trying to find an area of agreement before we begin to disagree. And in that sense, Jaspers called it pre-political. In other words, because political will always be founded on disagreement. He said, he was asking, but is there something before that? Some people will disagree. Some people will say, no, we begin with disagreement, we end with disagreement. They might say that. And all I'm saying is, but we should try to enlarge the ground of agreement as much as possible. So conceptually, I think there is a before the disagreement. So you and I might disagree on everything I've said, but I'm trying to persuade you to create as much a ground of agreement as possible so that we can disagree more clearly about our disagreements.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Chakrabarty. Thank you for your generous contribution and explanations and elaborations. I have other questions to ask, but I want to also give the floor to our audience. So the Q&A has started. You can send us your questions by using the Q&A box. So we have a question from Cecilia Vergnano. So dear Dipesh, thanks for the presentation. I am following you with a lot of interest. However, it's not clear to me what do you mean when you point to the difference between the meaning of globe in the expressions globalization and global warming. Can you please clarify this point?
Sure. So I mean, I hope it will be clear when my book comes out. So it actually goes to the heart of the distinction I make between globe and the planet. And, and the way I explain it is to say that, look at the literature on globalization. You will find that, I mean, one good text to go to is still, in spite of being old, is Carl Schmitt's The Nomos of the Earth. So you will see, if you go to Hannah Arendt's Human Condition, you will find that globalization is mainly a history of the last 500 years, of the expansion of Europe, of European imperialism, of the development of technology, whereby Europeans could actually navigate deep oceans, eventually the air, of the taking of other people's lands, of settler colonialism, of the history of new slavery, the Atlantic slavery, of empires like British Empire in India, not a formal colony, but a British empire. Globalization is eventually the history of how capitalism evolves out of the European imperial expansion. You can't separate the two. You can't. But globalization is a history where humans are central to the story. Global warming is partly a story about how the planet responds to human actions. So if we take a lot of oil and gas out of the planet and burn it, producing a lot of carbon dioxide that goes to the atmosphere, then the planet responds in a certain way which results in warming or results in acidification of the seas. Species die, or the seas rising, threatening coastal lands, producing climate refugees, all of those things. So the globe in global warming refers to the planet, which has been studied by geologists, by biologists, by atmospheric chemists, by all kinds of scientists. And that's why when you talk about globalization and global warming together, the discussion of global warming in the humanities forces us to know about things that we normally did not know in reading about globalization. Carbon dioxide, sea level rise, acidification of the seas, the conveyor belt, the current in the North Atlantic that has a role to play in maintaining the climate of the system. These are things that we did not talk about in discussing empires and discussing the horrible things that Europeans did. So the difference is that the globalization is about humans. Global warming is a story about what the planet does, and it decenters the humans. In the same way as you cannot do a geological history of the planet by making humans central, or a biological history of evolution by making humans central, for the simple reason that we come very late in the story. So I'll give you one example just to explain it and I'll stop answering this question. Think of the air, which is now also warming up. This air has 21% oxygen. So the air has to maintain oxygen at a level where it doesn't go too high so that things don't become inflammable. If there's too much oxygen in the air, all the forests will burn and die. If there's very little oxygen in the air, you and I will choke to death. So it has to be maintained. And the problem with maintaining oxygen at that level is that because of the nature of the gas oxygen, you have to constantly give the air fresh oxygen. So first of all, if you ask, for how long has the atmosphere been doing this? Getting fresh air, maintaining oxygen? The answer is 375 million years. So who does it? Microbes do it, fungi do it, plants do it, vegetable plants, trees do it, phytoplanktons in the seas do it. But we depend on that oxygen. We depend on this air, we breathe it. So you can see that this modern atmosphere was not made with us in view, because we have been around only for 300,000 years. So now you can see that the globe in global warming is about Earth system, planetary history, much bigger scale history, which decenters humans. Globalization, the globe of globalization is what humans created out of the Earth. So it's all about us. So globalization is anthropocentric. Global warming is a story that is not so anthropocentric in its telling.
Yeah, thanks for the insightful answer. There is a question again coming back to responsibility. So I would like to ask Dipesh about taxing pollution and ecological taxation as one of the proposed solutions to create accountability, responsibility for global warming. What's your take on this? Or would this enlarge already capitalist and post-colonial infrastructure where an uneven responsibility will fall on the global south?
No, I mean, I see in an ideal world, I would like to see transfer of technology from the developed countries to the less developed countries. In an ideal world, I would like to see at least a tax on carbon emissions, if not the banning of coal production. Coal is the most offensive of fossil fuels. In an ideal world, this is what we would want to see, but and you would want to see some recognition of historical responsibility as well as some recognition of contemporary responsibility. In an ideal world, I would have a global income tax on the rich, no matter which nation, and distribute that money for the poor. In an ideal world, the ideal world is actually crying out for some kind of global governance in different aspects of life, not everywhere. But the ideal world is saying there should be a global management of this problem. Because I don't think the rich of the China today can escape their responsibility, or India can escape their. So ideally, I would want to have a global income tax on these people. But you can't do that. They all hide behind their nation state mechanisms and influence that to determine the level of tax they have to pay. So they influence the laws. So yes, in ideal world, I would love to see all this. But the basic point is this, that the crisis is now of such dimensions that the need for global regulation, the need for global agencies that have the power to actually carry out effective global regulation, that need has become clear. But that doesn't mean it will translate, because the Americans might be too powerful as a government to scuttle things. There's still the Security Council, which powerful nations use to their own advantage. So this is only my wish of what would happen in an ideal world.
Yeah, thank you. So we have reached the end of our session today. Thank you, Professor Chakrabarty, for being with us today and accepting our invitation and for your contribution. Thank you to the audience for being with us today and your questions. So our next event will be in 2 weeks. We will be talking about a key conception of political science, sovereignty, and how we can offer decolonial understanding to sovereignty by offering non-Eurocentric perspectives on this highly important concept of political science and international relations. So please register for the event, and you can also subscribe to our newsletter for the upcoming events too. We have 3 more events before Christmas, and you can find the program on our website and in the newsletter. So this video will be posted on the YouTube channel of the Amsterdam Institute for Social Science Research. So watch it again and share within your circles. Again, thank you, Professor Chakrabarty, for being with us. Thank you to the audience, and I wish you a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on your program. Thank you very much. Thanks. Bye.